I always believed I had life perfectly figured out. Who wouldn't think that when they're standing at the pinnacle of their career? Admired, respected, maybe even feared a little? I was the managing director of a thriving company, commanding boardrooms with the kind of confidence that made people listen. My life looked like a masterpiece on the surface. A highly successful career. A home so immaculate it seemed to glow in the sunlight. And a husband, Jacob, who could easily be the poster boy for perfection. Jacob was the kind of man every woman dreams of marrying. He brought me coffee in bed every morning, never forgot a single anniversary, and made it his mission to remind me daily that I was the funniest person alive. Life felt like a fairy tale that had somehow turned real. I had it all, or so I thought. But life, as it turns out, is never quite as picture-perfect as it seems. It has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. And mine came in the form of a man named Gas. He wasn't just anyone. He was one of my employees. When I hired him, my mind was purely on business. Gas was sharp, ambitious, and brimming with energy. His ideas, even the most mundane ones, seemed electrified when he spoke, like they carried a spark capable of igniting the entire room. And then there was his smile, an unguarded, radiant grin that seemed to light up the air around him. It was the kind of smile that made you feel like the world wasn't such a bad place after all. The day Gas walked into my office for his interview, I remember being struck by how his presence seemed to change the atmosphere. It wasn't something I could explain, just a feeling, fleeting but unforgettable. I dismissed it as nothing more than a good first impression. At the time, everything between us was strictly professional. He called me M, a nickname he came up with during his first week, and I referred to him as a promising young talent. Our conversations were dominated by spreadsheets, project deadlines, and corporate jargon. But slowly, imperceptibly, something began to change. It started innocently enough, as these things often do. One day, I commented on his tie, a loud, colorful accessory that clashed hilariously with the subdued tones of our office. "Nice tie," I said with a smirk. "Are you auditioning for the circus?" "Thanks, M." He shot back with that trademark grin. I figured the office could use some brightening up. That tiny moment of levity caught me off guard. Gas had a way of disarming me, of breaking through the polished, professional exterior I wore like armor. What began as harmless banter soon turned into light-hearted jokes about the office coffee machine's tendency to break down or ridiculous excuses for being late to meetings. "Sorry, M," he said one day, strolling in 5 minutes past the start time. "Got stuck behind a parade of ducks crossing the road. I think they had somewhere important to be." I knew I shouldn't laugh as hard as I did, but there was something about his humor that made me feel alive. For years, I had worn my role as managing director like a second skin, composed, unflappable, and always in control. But Gas had this way of peeling back those layers, of reminding me what it felt like to relax, to laugh, to feel. I told myself it was harmless. What's the big deal about a little flirtation, right? That's what I whispered to myself in the quiet of the night, trying to silence the nagging voice in my head that warned me I was playing with fire. It didn't happen all at once. The lines blurred slowly, like ink spreading across a page, until it was impossible to tell where professional ended and personal began. One late night in the office, as we worked side by side on a particularly demanding project, Gas said something that changed everything. The room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning, the kind of quiet that amplifies every small sound. "You work too hard, Deborah," he said, his voice soft but steady. "You deserve someone who takes care of you for a change." I laughed, a nervous, awkward laugh, because I didn't know how else to respond. His words hit a nerve I didn't even realize was exposed. When was the last time someone had said something like that to me? Jacob loved me. I knew that. But lately, our conversations had devolved into discussions about groceries and utility bills. Before I could process what was happening, Gas leaned in and kissed me. For a split second, every logical thought in my brain screamed at me to stop, to push him away, to remember who I was and what was at stake. But my body didn't listen. I let it happen, and in that moment, it felt like I was breaking free and falling apart all at once. From there, it spiraled. What began as stolen moments turned into something deeper, more consuming. I found myself inventing reasons to stay late at the office, lying to Jacob about non-existent deadlines. Gas made me feel like the heroine of a story I hadn't realized I'd been yearning to live. He saw me, not as the polished professional or the perfect wife, but as a woman. For 2 years, I led a double life. During the day, I was Deborah, the powerhouse managing director, the devoted wife. But at night, I was someone else entirely, swept up in a whirlwind of passion and recklessness. I told myself it was a phase, a temporary escape from the monotony of my life. But it wasn't. It became something I couldn't control. What I didn't see coming was how dangerous Gas could be. He wasn't just a charming employee. He was calculating. Somewhere along the way, he started documenting our affair, pictures, messages, stolen moments frozen in time. Those images became his weapon, a silent threat hanging over me like a guillotine. When Gas started making demands, I realized just how much power I had given him. His requests weren't small or innocent, they were dangerous. The kind of demands that could destroy everything I had worked so hard to build. Now, as I stand at the edge of this precipice, I can't help but wonder, how did I let it get this far? How did I, a woman who had everything, risk losing it all for a man who was never who he seemed to be? And here I am, sitting alone in the quiet of a dimly lit room, trying to untangle the mess I've made of my life, my career, my marriage, my reputation. Everything I've spent years building is teetering on the edge of ruin. The worst part? There's no one to blame but myself. How did I let it come to this? How did I allow my choices to spiral so far out of control? It all started on a seemingly ordinary Friday evening. I was in my office, pretending to finish up reports that barely held my attention. The hum of the computer and the muffled sounds of the bustling office felt like white noise as my mind wandered elsewhere. Then, Gas walked in. He didn't knock. He never did. This time, though, he shut the door behind him with a deliberate finality, and his usual playful smirk was gone. Instead, his face was shadowed with something I could only describe as cold determination. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but firm as he sat across from me. My stomach dropped. In all our time together, he had never looked at me like this, so serious, so calculating. "What is it, Gas?" I asked, forcing an air of calm I didn't feel. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on my desk as if he were about to deliver a final ultimatum. "I've been patient, Deborah," he began, his words measured and deliberate. "But I can't keep doing this. I want more." "More?" I echoed, though I already knew exactly what he meant. He nodded, his gaze boring into mine. "I'm tired of being your secret. You either tell Jacob the truth, or I will." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. My chest tightened, and I felt the walls of the room closing in around me. "Gas, you can't mean that," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. "Do you have any idea what this would do to me? To us? My career, my reputation, everything I've worked for would be destroyed." "And what about me?" he snapped, his voice rising. "Do you think I'm happy being your dirty little secret? I've given you 2 years, Deborah, 2 years of hiding, waiting, pretending. I'm done waiting." I tried to reason with him, pleading with him to understand what was at stake. But he wasn't listening. His frustration bubbled over, and with a sharp shake of his head, he stormed out of my office, leaving me reeling. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the look in his eyes and the threat in his words. I kept imagining Jacob's face if he ever found out. The thought of his heartbreak was unbearable. He didn't deserve this. None of it. But the truth? The truth was that I couldn't bring myself to let Gas go. The days that followed were torture. Gas kept his distance, a calculated move that left me suspended in a state of anxious uncertainty. Every minute I spent alone with my thoughts felt like an eternity. I hated the power he held over me, the way he could unravel my life with a single decision. Just as I thought he might have cooled off, he showed up unannounced at my house. It was a quiet evening, Jacob was working late, and I was curled up on the couch with a glass of wine, trying to drown out the gnawing guilt that had become my constant companion. The doorbell rang, and when I opened it, there he was. Gas. Seeing him standing there, so brazen and unapologetic, was like a slap in the face. "What are you doing here?" I hissed, pulling him inside before the neighbors could see. "I wanted to see you," he said casually, as if this were normal, as if his presence in my home wasn't the ticking time bomb it truly was. "You can't just show up here," I whispered harshly, my voice trembling with panic. "Do you have any idea what would happen if Jacob came home and saw you?" He leaned in, his smirk returning with a dangerous edge. "Maybe that's what needs to happen. Maybe then you'll finally make a decision." I pushed him away, my mind racing. How had it come to this? How had I allowed myself to lose control so completely? But Gas wasn't finished. His texts became relentless, his calls intrusive, his demands insistent. He wanted answers, a resolution, and he wasn't willing to wait any longer. "Tell him, Deborah," he said one night during a heated argument, "or I will." His words followed me everywhere. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. Every time Jacob looked at me, I felt his unspoken questions weighing on me. "You've been distant," he said one evening over dinner, his voice laced with quiet concern. "Is everything okay?" I forced a smile, lying through my teeth. "Everything's fine." But Jacob wasn't a fool, and I knew he sensed the cracks in the facade. Meanwhile, Gas grew bolder, leaving notes on my desk, showing up uninvited. "You don't have much time." One note read, "Make your choice." One night, as the weight of it all became too much, I broke down. It wasn't the kind of breakdown you see in movies, with a single dramatic tear sliding down a porcelain cheek. It was ugly. Sobs racked my body as I sat on the living room floor in oversized pajamas, surrounded by the remnants of takeout dinners and crumpled tissues. I had two choices. Option 1, come clean, walk up to Jacob, look him in the eye, and confess everything. But the thought of his heartbreak, his disappointment, was more than I could bear. Option 2, end things with Gas, for good. Make him disappear from my life, not in a sinister way. Though I admit the thought of sending him to Antarctica crossed my mind in my darkest moments. But the truth? Neither option felt possible. And the longer I waited, the smaller my world became. I began my research late at night, long after Jacob had drifted into the deep, undisturbed sleep of someone unburdened by secrets. The house was eerily silent, save for the occasional groan of the old pipes and the whisper of wind against the windows. My laptop cast a pale glow in the darkness as I morphed into a full-fledged Google ninja, frantically typing search queries like, "How to deal with blackmail? Is it possible to fire someone without triggering a lawsuit?" And my personal favorite, "Can you legally disappear and start over in another country without telling anyone?" Each click led me deeper into a labyrinth of dubious advice and half-baked solutions. One idea that felt almost plausible, at least in the early hours of desperation, was transferring Gas to a different branch, perhaps somewhere remote and isolated, where cell service was a myth and Wi-Fi a distant dream. Yet, even as I considered this, I knew in my heart it wouldn't work. Gas wasn't motivated by a corner office or a higher paycheck. No. His ambitions were darker and far more personal. He wasn't the kind of man to let go until he had taken what he truly wanted. And what he wanted was me. Every time I thought about confronting him, my mind spiraled into a chaotic storm of what-ifs. What if he retaliated by telling Jacob everything? What if he went to my boss and destroyed my career in one fell swoop? The mere thought of Gas holding that kind of power over me made my skin crawl. I felt trapped in a cage of my own making, and no amount of frantic Googling could conjure the perfect escape plan. As I sat there, staring at the blinking cursor on my screen, a chilling realization crept over me. This wasn't just about keeping an affair hidden. This was about preserving the fragile framework of my entire life, the life I had painstakingly built piece by piece. And the most terrifying part? I wasn't sure I had the strength to hold it all together. Jacob began to notice. His questions came slowly at first, couched in casual curiosity. "You've been working late a lot these days," he said one evening. his voice tinged with an edge of doubt. Then there were the furtive phone calls I couldn't quite explain. The moments I brushed him off with vague excuses. I could see the trust in his eyes waver. A slow, heartbreaking erosion that mirrored my own unraveling. And Gaz? He wasn't content to sit in the shadows. No, he decided to take matters into his own hands. Subtle at first, sly remarks to my colleagues that seemed innocuous but planted seeds of doubt. Deborah and I were burning the midnight oil again, he'd say with a knowing smile. It didn't take long for the rumors to start. Small whispers that swelled into a tide of speculation. One afternoon, I overheard two coworkers whispering in the break room, their voices low but sharp enough to pierce the air. "Have you noticed how close Deborah and Gaz are getting lately?" one asked, her tone dripping with curiosity. "I mean, she's the boss." The other replied, "But I doubt those late-night meetings are just about work." My blood turned to ice. Coffee cup in hand, I froze, unable to move or breathe as panic surged through me. The walls of my carefully constructed life were crumbling, and I could feel the pieces slipping through my fingers. That evening, Jacob was waiting for me when I walked through the door. His arms were crossed, his face a storm of anger and hurt. "Deborah," he began, his voice low but brimming with restrained emotion. "What's going on between you and Gaz?" My heart stopped. My mouth went dry. I tried to summon a believable lie, something to defuse the situation, but nothing felt convincing enough. So, I fell back on denial. "What are you talking about?" I forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow even to my ears. "Gaz is just an employee. This is ridiculous." Jacob's eyes told me everything I needed to know. He didn't believe me. He didn't yell or accuse me outright. But the way he looked at me, like I was a stranger he couldn't recognize, hurt more than any words could. Just when I thought things couldn't spiral any further out of control, Gaz escalated. An email landed in my inbox. Its subject line innocuous but its contents devastating. Attached were photos, intimate, damning, and taken without my knowledge. My stomach twisted as I stared at the screen, bile rising in my throat. His message was chillingly simple. "Meet my demands, or Jacob sees these." Panic overwhelmed me. I wanted to scream, cry, smash my laptop into oblivion. How had it come to this? Gaz wasn't just holding a loaded gun to my life, he was aiming it, finger on the trigger, waiting for me to flinch. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I knew I couldn't let him control me any longer. The fear, the guilt, the suffocating weight of his threats, it was too much. I had to fight back. But how? How do you battle someone who holds every one of your secrets, every mistake, in his grasp? The answer came slowly, like the first light of dawn breaking through darkness. I needed leverage, evidence, something to expose him before he could destroy me, and I couldn't do it alone. I turned to Clara, my assistant of many years. She was loyal, sharp, and above all, someone I could trust. Late one evening, when the office was empty, I closed the door and confided in her. "Clara," I whispered, my voice trembling, "I need your help. I'm in way over my head." Her eyes widened, concern flickering across her face. "Deborah, what's going on?" I told her everything, the affair, the blackmail, the photos. She listened intently, her expression shifting from shock to determination. When I finished, she leaned forward, her voice steady. "We'll figure this out," she said firmly. "But we have to be smart. If we make one wrong move, it could all come crashing down." Together, we devised a plan, a calculated risk to turn the tables on Gaz. The idea was simple but bold. Set a trap and catch him in the act. We staged a fake meeting under the guise of discussing a sensitive company matter. I sent him an email, carefully worded to pique his interest, inviting him to the conference room late that evening. If there was one thing I knew about Gaz, it was that he wouldn't be able to resist. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. The battle was far from over, but at least now, I was no longer fighting alone. When he finally took the bait, I turned on the charm, carefully masking every trace of the storm brewing beneath my composed exterior. I played my part to perfection, laughing at the right moments, leaning in as though his words held the gravity of the world, and steering the conversation to make him feel in control. We began by discussing mundane business matters, market strategies, quarterly targets, the usual, but as the evening unfolded, I gently guided the dialogue into more personal waters. The shift was subtle but deliberate, weaving a false sense of intimacy that fed his growing confidence. It didn't take long for him to take the hook. His responses grew bolder, teetering on the edge of arrogance. The mask of professionalism slipped, and his true colors bled through. As the drinks flowed, so did his words. Soon, he was sending me a stream of damning messages. Each one painted a picture of a man drunk on power, boasting about how easily he could ruin me if I failed to comply with his demands. Some were shockingly explicit, others veiled threats wrapped in charm. I documented them all meticulously, saving every message like a chess player recording each calculated move. The trap was set, and he had walked right into it. For a moment, I thought I had won. My plan had worked flawlessly, or so I believed. But life rarely unfolds in neat, predictable patterns. Despite my careful scheming, the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. One evening, Jacob confronted me. His face was ghostly pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and pain that pierced me to my core. "Deborah," he whispered, the tremor in his voice betraying the depth of his emotions. "I know everything." It felt as though the air had been sucked from my lungs. I had rehearsed this moment 100 times in my head, imagining all the ways Jacob might react if he ever discovered the truth. I had braced myself for shouting, anger, or even him storming out in a dramatic display of betrayal. But nothing could have prepared me for the way he simply stood there, staring at me as if I were a stranger wearing the face of someone he once loved. His voice, though soft, cut deeper than any scream ever could. "How could you?" he asked, his words echoing like a judge's gavel in the silence of the room. I felt the weight of his heartbreak crush me. I thought I had lost him in that moment, that nothing I could say or do would ever mend the damage I had inflicted. The pain in his eyes was unbearable, a mirror reflecting my own guilt and regret. Yet, despite everything, he didn't leave right away. Instead, he turned his pain into action. Jacob went straight to confront Gas. The confrontation was explosive. Even from the hallway, I could hear their voices rising like thunderclaps, each word charged with anger and accusation. My heart pounded as I imagined the scene unfolding, a tempest of fury and betrayal threatening to spiral out of control. For a long moment, fear paralyzed me. I was terrified of what Jacob might do, of how far his rage could push him. Summoning every ounce of courage, I stepped into the room, only to find Jacob storming out. His face was a mask of cold resolve, and his silence was more devastating than any words he could have spoken. He didn't look at me. He didn't say a single word. He just left. I stood there in the aftermath, surrounded by the wreckage of my own making. Shame, regret, and fear swirled around me like a storm I couldn't escape. But surrender wasn't an option. I couldn't allow things to spiral further out of control. With Clara's unwavering support, I gathered the evidence I had painstakingly collected and presented it to HR. The response was swift and decisive. Gas was terminated immediately, escorted out of the building, and slapped with a restraining order. Just like that, he was out of my life. The relief I felt was immense, but it was far from a happy ending. Removing Gas was just the first step in a long and grueling journey. The real battle lay ahead, rebuilding what I had so carelessly jeopardized. Jacob and I began counseling shortly after. Each session was like peeling back layers of wounds we had both inflicted and endured. Trust, once shattered, proved incredibly difficult to restore. Every word, every gesture felt like a fragile bridge between us, one that could collapse under the weight of lingering doubts and unspoken fears. But I was determined. I poured every ounce of my energy into proving that I could be better, that I was worth the second chance he had begrudgingly offered. Yet, the scars remained. They lingered like shadows, a constant reminder of the betrayal that had nearly destroyed us. Even during moments of progress, the past loomed large, a silent specter that neither of us could ignore. I often wondered if we would ever truly move past it, if the damage I had caused could ever be fully undone. Still, I refused to give up. I owed it to Jacob, to myself, and to the life we had almost lost. Each day was a step forward, no matter how small. And though the road was long and fraught with challenges, I held on to the hope that one day, we could find our way back to each other. Thank you for taking the time to watch our videos, and especially subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos. Our channel will always update interesting content. Thank you and see you in the next videos.